The American Civil War, remembered primarily as the conflict that ended slavery and preserved the Union, as the bloodiest war in American history with over 600,000 dead, as the defining crisis that tested whether democratic government could survive internal division, was also the crucible that transformed American capitalism, that turned corporations from small, limited entities serving specific narrow purposes into massive permanent institutions with powers approaching and sometimes exceeding those of governments. And this transformation wasn't intentional, wasn't planned by Lincoln or Congress or business leaders, but emerged from the emergency measures and institutional innovations required to finance and supply an industrial war of unprecedented scale, because the war required mobilizing economic resources on a level America had never attempted, required creating new forms of business organization and new relationships between government and private enterprise, required legal innovations that gave corporations powers and protections they'd never had, required financial mechanisms that funneled enormous capital into private hands. And these wartime expedients, justified as temporary emergency measures, became permanent features of American capitalism, survived the war's end, expanded during Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, and created the corporate economy that dominates today, where a few hundred corporations control most economic activity, where corporate legal personhood grants them constitutional rights, where limited liability protects shareholders from consequences of corporate actions, where perpetual existence allows corporations to accumulate power across generations, and where the relationship between government and big business is so intertwined that distinguishing public from private interest becomes nearly impossible. And understanding how this happened, how a war to preserve democratic government inadvertently created institutions that would challenge democratic control, how emergency measures became permanent structures, how wartime contracting created the template for corporate dominance of government, and how legal innovations meant to facilitate war finance became tools for corporate power. This reveals fundamental truths about how crises reshape institutions, how short-term necessities create long-term consequences, and how the infrastructure of modern corporate capitalism was built not gradually through market evolution, but suddenly through war emergency, making the Civil War as important economically as it was politically. The moment when America pivoted from a nation of small proprietors and limited corporations to a corporate capitalist economy where giant firms would dominate, and where the relationship between economic and political power would fundamentally change in ways that still shape American life. The pre-war corporate landscape was radically different from what would emerge. Because corporations existed but were rare and strictly limited, you couldn't just form a corporation. You needed a special charter from a state legislature, and these charters were granted sparingly and only for specific public purposes: building a canal or bridge, operating a bank, running a railroad, providing water to a city. And the charters were temporary, typically lasting 20 or 30 years, after which the corporation dissolved unless the legislature renewed the charter. And they were limited in scope. The charter specified exactly what business the corporation could conduct. It couldn't expand into other areas without new legislative approval. And they were limited in size. Charters often specified maximum capitalization, how much money the corporation could raise, and they came with conditions, requirements to serve public interest, rate regulations, obligations to provide service, and the chartering legislature retained power to revoke charters if corporations violated terms or acted against public interest. And shareholders had unlimited liability in many states, meaning if the corporation failed or caused harm, shareholders could be sued for their personal assets, not just their investment. And this made corporate investment risky, discouraged speculation, kept corporations relatively small and focused, and most economic activity happened through sole proprietorships and partnerships, individual owners, and small firms where owners had direct control and faced full liability. So corporations were exceptional, were tools for specific purposes requiring capital beyond what individuals could provide, were granted as privileges not rights, and were kept under democratic control through legislative oversight. But the Civil War shattered this system, created pressures and opportunities that transformed corporate law and practice in ways that would never be reversed. The scale of war mobilization required new forms of business organization, because the Union needed to equip and supply armies of hundreds of thousands of men, needed weapons and ammunition and uniforms and boots and tents and wagons and horses and food and medicine, needed them in quantities that no existing business could provide, and needed them continuously for years. And traditional small-scale manufacturing couldn't meet these demands. Individual proprietors and small partnerships lacked the capital to build factories, to purchase machinery, to maintain inventory, to extend credit to government, and the government couldn't manufacture everything itself, lacked facilities and expertise, so the solution was corporate organization, allowing multiple investors to pool capital, to share risk, to create enterprises large enough to supply the armies and state governments. Previously restrictive about corporate charters, began granting them more freely, simplified the process, passed general incorporation laws allowing anyone to form a corporation without special legislative approval, just file paperwork and pay fees, and removed many restrictions, extended charter durations, loosened limits on capitalization and business scope, and reduced shareholder liability. And this happened quickly, driven by war emergency, justified as temporary measures to mobilize economy for victory. And it worked. Corporations formed rapidly, manufactured weapons and supplies. Northern industrial capacity expanded enormously during the war despite enormous casualties and military mobilization. And this demonstrated the power of corporate organization, showed that corporations could accomplish what smaller entities couldn't, could mobilize capital and organize production and operate at scale. And this success created momentum for further liberalization after the war, created belief that corporate form was essential for economic development, that restrictions were obstacles to progress, that unlimited corporate power served public interest by enabling growth. The government contracting system that emerged during the war created template for corporate-government relationships that persist today because the government needed suppliers but couldn't efficiently manage thousands of small contracts, couldn't negotiate individually with every producer, couldn't monitor quality and delivery across fragmented supply chains. So it consolidated, worked with larger firms that could handle big orders, that could deliver consistently, that could manage subcontracts. And this favored corporations over small proprietors, gave them preferential access to government business, and the contracts were often extremely profitable. Government paid premium prices for urgency, cost-plus arrangements guaranteed profits, and enforcement was weak, quality control was spotty, opportunities for fraud were enormous, and many contractors exploited this, delivered shoddy goods, overcharged, bribed officials, and grew rich while soldiers suffered from defective weapons and rotten food. The shoddy aristocracy, as they were called, knew rich who profited from war while others died. But the scandals didn't stop the system. Contracts kept flowing, corporations kept growing, and the pattern established was government dependence on large corporate suppliers, revolving door between government procurement officials and corporate management, political influence through campaign contributions and lobbying, and corruption that was tolerated because the alternatives seemed worse, seemed like it would disrupt supply and harm the war effort. And this pattern continued after the war. Government kept working with large corporate suppliers, kept paying premium prices, kept tolerating corruption. Because the relationships were established, the corporations had expertise and capacity, and breaking up the system seemed difficult and risky. So the wartime emergency contracting became peacetime normal practice, became the foundation for military, industrial complex, for agricultural subsidies, for infrastructure projects, for all the ways government spending flows to corporations, creating dependencies and corruption that undermined both capitalism and democracy. The railroad corporations were the war's biggest beneficiaries and became the template for corporate power in the Gilded Age. Because railroads were essential to moving troops and supplies, the Union's railroad network was crucial advantage over the South, and the government needed railroads to expand, to reach new territories, to integrate the national economy. So it subsidized construction massively, through land grants, giving railroads millions of acres of public land along their routes, through direct subsidies paying per mile of track constructed, through loan guarantees reducing risk to investors. And this created enormous fortunes for railroad promoters. Men like Leland Stanford and Collis Huntington and Jay Gould, who built railroads with public money and kept the profits, who sold the granted land for enormous sums, who manipulated stock and bond markets, who bribed legislators and judges, and who built corporations of unprecedented size and power, corporations that controlled transportation across entire regions, that could set rates and destroy competitors, that employed thousands and influenced millions. And these railroad corporations pioneered the tactics that other corporations would copy: stock watering, where they issued shares far beyond actual value; monopolistic practices crushing competition; political corruption buying favorable legislation and blocking regulation; and vertical integration controlling everything from coal mines to hotels. And they pioneered the legal arguments for corporate power, hired the best lawyers who developed theories of corporate constitutional rights, who argued that corporations were persons entitled to due process and equal protection, who fought state regulation as unconstitutional interference with property rights. And the railroads had resources to pursue these arguments through courts, to appeal repeatedly, to wear down opponents. And they largely won. Judges sympathetic to corporate power or convinced by legal theories ruled in their favor, established precedents protecting corporations from regulation. And this created legal framework where corporations had rights but limited responsibilities, where they could operate across state lines while states struggled to regulate them, where federal government was distant and weak and often captured by corporate interests. And this framework enabled corporate dominance in the Gilded Age, enabled trusts and monopolies, enabled exploitation of workers and customers and investors. And all of this traced back to the Civil War, to the emergency measures that created powerful railroad corporations, to the subsidies and land grants that enriched them, to the weakened regulation that gave them freedom, and to the legal innovations that protected them from democratic control. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 created federal support for corporate banking and transformed American finance. Because before the war, banking was chaotic, state-chartered banks issued their own currencies, thousands of different banknotes circulated, counterfeiting was rampant, credit was unreliable, and the system couldn't support war finance, couldn't provide the loans the government needed, couldn't mobilize the nation's capital for military purposes. So Congress created the National Banking System, allowed banks to receive federal charters, required them to hold government bonds as reserves, allowed them to issue national banknotes backed by those bonds. And this created captive market for government debt. Banks had to buy bonds to operate, and it created uniform national currency, replacing the chaos of state banknotes, and it centralized financial power. National banks were larger and more powerful than most state banks, were networked together, could move capital efficiently, and this system survived the war, became permanent feature of American finance. And it favored large banks over small, favored corporate banking over local banking, and it created the bond market infrastructure that would later enable corporate financing on massive scale, because banks that held government bonds, that understood bond markets, that had relationships with investors, could easily shift to underwriting corporate bonds. And this created Wall Street as we know it. The investment banks that would finance corporate expansion, that would organize mergers and acquisitions, that would create the trusts and monopolies of the Gilded Age, and it created the revolving door between finance and government. Bankers who served in Treasury during the war and returned to banking after, who used government connections for private profit, who shaped policy to favor financial interests. And this pattern continued, the close relationship between big finance and federal government, each serving the other's interests, each dependent on the other. And this relationship was built during the Civil War, through the emergency measures that created national banking system. And it persisted because it served powerful interests, served big banks that profited from the system, served government that needed banks to finance debt. And the public interest in competitive, diversified banking was sacrificed to these concentrated interests. The legal doctrine of corporate personhood was dramatically expanded during and after the war, creating constitutional protections that would make corporate regulation extremely difficult. Because corporations had always been artificial entities, legal fictions created by government for specific purposes, they weren't natural persons with inherent rights. But corporate lawyers began arguing that corporations deserved constitutional protections, that the 14th Amendment's guarantee of due process applied to corporations, that states couldn't regulate corporations without violating their constitutional rights. And these arguments initially seemed absurd. The 14th Amendment was meant to protect freed slaves, to ensure equal treatment regardless of race. But corporate lawyers argued that persons in the amendment included corporations, that corporations couldn't be deprived of property without due process, that discriminatory state regulation violated equal protection, and sympathetic judges, many of them former corporate lawyers themselves, began accepting these arguments. And the key case was Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad in 1886, where the Supreme Court simply declared, without argument or analysis, that corporations were persons under the 14th Amendment, entitled to constitutional protections, and this revolutionized corporate law, meant that regulations could be challenged as unconstitutional, that corporations could use federal courts to override state regulation, that corporate property rights were protected at highest constitutional level. And this made the regulatory state that progressives would try to build in the early 20th century enormously difficult, because every regulation faced constitutional challenge. Every attempt to control corporate power had to overcome corporate constitutional rights. And this doctrine of corporate personhood, this legal fiction that gave corporations rights meant for humans, traced back to the Civil War era, to the legal innovations developed to facilitate corporate growth, to the sympathetic judges appointed during Republican dominance, to the legal culture that saw corporate power as beneficial and regulation as threat. And once established, the doctrine became entrenched, became precedent that later courts followed, became part of constitutional structure that's nearly impossible to change, making corporations permanently powerful in ways that purely economic forces could never achieve, because legal protections insulated them from democratic control, from market accountability, from the consequences of their actions. The contract labor law of 1864 demonstrated how war emergency created corporate power over workers, because the union needed labor for factories and farms while men were fighting, and corporations wanted cheap, reliable workers. So Congress passed law allowing employers to import contract laborers from Europe, workers who would sign contracts binding them to years of labor in exchange for passage to America. And this was essentially indentured servitude. Workers couldn't leave or change. Employers, without breaching contract, could be sued or even imprisoned for quitting. And this gave corporations enormous power over workers, power to dictate terms, to resist wage demands, to break strikes. And the law was justified as war emergency measure, as necessary to maintain production. But it created precedent for corporate control of labor, established principle that government would help corporations obtain and control workers, that labor rights were secondary to production needs. And even after the law was repealed in 1868, the attitudes and practices persisted. Corporations continued importing contract labor through various schemes, continued using legal system to enforce labor discipline, continued relying on government to suppress strikes and labor organizing. And this relationship between corporate power and state violence, between business interests and police power, this was forged during the Civil War through emergency measures that prioritized production over rights, that treated workers as resources to be mobilized rather than citizens with autonomy. And this legacy poisoned American labor relations for generations, made union organizing brutally difficult, made strikes occasions for violence, made corporate power over workers nearly absolute. And all of this traced to the war, to the emergency that justified extraordinary measures, measures that became normal practice, that shaped how corporations and government viewed workers as problems to be controlled rather than stakeholders to be respected. The tariff system established during the war created permanent subsidy for corporate industry and became tool for political corruption, because the union needed revenue and wanted to protect northern manufacturers from British competition. So Congress raised tariffs to unprecedented levels, taxed imports heavily, and this protected American manufacturers from foreign competition, allowed them to charge higher prices, guaranteed their profits. And after the war, the tariffs remained high. Manufacturers lobbied to keep them, argued that American industry needed protection to develop, that workers benefited from protected jobs, and Republican politicians supported high tariffs partly from ideological conviction, partly because manufacturers provided campaign funding. And this created a system where specific industries got specific protections through tariff schedules. And this became vehicle for corruption. Manufacturers would lobby for higher duties on their products, would contribute to campaigns, would hire former congressmen as lobbyists, and the tariff schedules became Christmas trees, ornaments for every industry with political influence. And consumers paid the cost through higher prices, and the system entrenched corporate power, protected inefficient firms from competition, allowed them to grow large and profitable behind tariff walls. And it demonstrated how government policy would be captured by corporate interests, how legislation meant to serve national interest would be twisted to serve specific firms, how the emergency measures of wartime would become permanent subsidies in peacetime, and the tariff system persisted for decades, remained central political issue through the Gilded Age, and while it eventually declined in importance, the pattern it established of using government policy to protect and enrich specific corporations, this became standard practice, continued through agricultural subsidies and defense contracts and tax breaks and regulatory capture, making the Civil War tariffs the template for corporate welfare state that exists today. The limited liability revolution that accelerated during the war fundamentally changed the relationship between capital and risk, because traditionally investors faced unlimited liability. If a business failed or caused harm, investors could lose not just their investment, but their personal assets, could be sued for business debts, and this made investment cautious, discouraged speculation, kept businesses relatively small, but limited liability, the principle that shareholders could only lose their investment, not their other property. This made investment much less risky, encouraged capital to flow into corporations, enabled growth to scales previously impossible, and limited liability spread rapidly during the war. States adopted it to attract corporate charters to compete with other states for incorporation revenue, and corporations embraced it, made investment more attractive, enabled them to raise capital more easily. And after the war, limited liability became universal, became standard feature of corporate law, and this had profound consequences. Separated ownership from control. Shareholders could invest without managing, without even understanding the business, just hoping for returns, and it separated ownership from responsibility. Shareholders weren't liable for corporate harms, weren't responsible for unsafe products or environmental damage or fraudulent practices. The corporation bore the liability, but the corporation was legal fiction with limited assets, so victims often couldn't recover damages. And this moral hazard encouraged excessive risk-taking, encouraged corporations to externalize costs, to pollute and defraud and exploit, because shareholders wouldn't pay the price. And limited liability enabled the giant corporations of the Gilded Age, the trusts that monopolized industries, because investors could pour capital into them without fearing personal liability. And it enabled the financial speculation that led to repeated crashes, because investors could gamble with corporate assets knowing their personal wealth was protected. And all of this acceleration in limited liability, this transformation from cautious exception to universal rule, happened during and immediately after the Civil War, driven by the capital demands of wartime industry, by the competition between states for corporate charters, by the ideology that saw corporate growth as national progress, and by the weakening of democratic controls that might have limited corporate power. And limited liability became so entrenched that reversing it became unthinkable, became foundation of modern capitalism, enabling enormous capital accumulation and economic growth, but also enabling enormous corporate power and corporate irresponsibility, creating entities that could harm millions while protecting their owners from consequences. The merger movement that created the trusts and monopolies of the late 19th century was enabled by legal and financial innovations from the war period, because corporations could now operate across state lines more easily, could raise capital through national banking system and emerging stock markets, could use limited liability to attract investors, could employ professional managers to operate at scale. And this enabled horizontal integration, buying up competitors to create monopolies, and vertical integration, controlling supply chains from raw materials to retail. And the first great trust was Standard Oil, Rockefeller combining dozens of refineries into a single corporation controlling 90% of American oil refining. But the pattern spread. Trusts emerged in sugar and tobacco and steel and railroads and meatpacking. And these monopolies had unprecedented economic power, could set prices, could crush competitors, could dictate terms to suppliers and customers, and they had unprecedented political power, could buy legislators and judges, could shape government policy, could resist regulation. And this concentration of economic power created the plutocracy of the Gilded Age, where a few hundred men controlled most American industry, where inequality reached extremes not seen before or since except perhaps today, where democratic government struggled to assert control over corporate power, and this corporate dominance traced directly to the Civil War, to the legal innovations that enabled it, to the financial infrastructure that funded it, to the weakened regulation that allowed it, to the ideology that celebrated it. And the war itself demonstrated that massive organizations could accomplish what smaller entities couldn't. The Union's victory was partly organizational triumph, its ability to mobilize resources through large-scale institutions. And this lesson was applied to peacetime economy. The belief that bigger was better, that consolidation created efficiency, that corporate power served progress. And this ideology combined with the legal and financial tools to create the corporate economy and attempts to resist this. The Granger movement and populists and eventually progressives. These movements achieved some reforms, but never fundamentally challenged corporate dominance. Because the legal and economic structures were too entrenched, the corporate power too great, the political influence too strong, and all of these structures, all of this power, traced back to the Civil War and its aftermath, to the transformation of American capitalism that happened during those years. The Supreme Court's increasing protection of corporate power in the late 19th century was staffed and shaped by justices appointed during the War and Reconstruction, because Lincoln and his Republican successors appointed judges sympathetic to corporate interests, who believed in free enterprise and property rights and limited government regulation. And these judges served for decades, shaped constitutional law for generations, and they consistently ruled in favor of corporate power, struck down regulations as unconstitutional, expanded corporate rights, limited government authority, and the key decisions, Santa Clara establishing corporate personhood, Lochner striking down labor regulations, dozens of others limiting state and federal power to control corporations. These were decided by judges whose worldview was formed during the Civil War era, who saw corporate growth as engine of progress, who viewed regulation as dangerous interference with natural economic laws, and who had often been corporate lawyers themselves, understood corporate arguments, were sympathetic to corporate interests, and this judicial protection of corporate power was enormously consequential, because it meant that even when democratic majorities wanted regulation, even when legislatures passed laws controlling corporations, courts could strike them down, could prevent democratic control of economic power. And this created the crisis of the Progressive Era and New Deal, the conflict between democratic government and corporate power, the question of whether the people or the corporations would control America. And this conflict traced back to the Civil War, to the legal revolution that empowered corporations, to the judges who protected that power, to the constitutional interpretations that made corporations nearly untouchable, and even the New Deal. Even the regulatory state that emerged from the Depression had to work within the framework established during the Civil War era, couldn't fundamentally challenge corporate personhood or limited liability or the basic structure of corporate capitalism, could only regulate around the edges, could constrain some corporate behavior, but couldn't break corporate power, and this limitation persists today. Corporations remain the dominant institutions in American life, more powerful in many ways than government, more influential over most people's daily lives than democratic institutions, and this corporate dominance traces back to the Civil War, to the transformation that happened during those years, proving that wars reshape not just political boundaries, but economic structures, not just through destruction, but through creation, through the innovations and expedients required to mobilize for total war, innovations that persist long after the war ends, that reshape peacetime society in ways nobody planned or intended, making the Civil War's economic legacy as profound as its political legacy, the war that ended slavery but that created new forms of power and domination, the war that preserved democracy but that empowered institutions that would challenge democratic control, the war that transformed America from a nation of small producers into a corporate capitalist economy where giant firms would dominate, where economic power would concentrate in ways the founders never imagined and would have feared, where corporations would become superpowers with resources and reach exceeding most governments, with constitutional rights but limited responsibilities, with ability to shape law and policy and culture, and with persistence across generations that allows them to accumulate power that no individual or democratic government can match, making the Civil War the crucible of corporate capitalism, the moment when American economy pivoted from one trajectory to another, from a future that might have been more democratic and egalitarian to the corporate-dominated present we inhabit, where understanding this history is essential to understanding contemporary corporate power, to recognizing that this power isn't natural or inevitable, but historically constructed, created through specific decisions and innovations during a specific crisis, and potentially subject to change through different decisions and innovations. Though the power structures created then and strengthened since make such change extraordinarily difficult, requiring confronting the entire legacy of the Civil Wars. Economic transformation, the legal doctrines and financial structures and political relationships that turn corporations into superpowers and that continue to shape American capitalism today.